Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So a topic that I want to talk about briefly using an example from history. This is More Swordsmen of the British Empire by D.A. Kinsley with an introduction by me. Is the subject of cuts versus thrusts, and I have done many videos about cut versus thrust in the past, and I will continue to do lots of videos because it's one of the big topics of swordsmanship. But one of the things that I've tried to make people aware of is that whilst there are times to cut and there are times to thrust, there are also some underlying themes that we see recurring in the historical sources associated with either cuts or thrusts. One of those being that thrusts very often entered the opponent more easily than cuts. Now obviously that's very dependent on situation. There are incidences from the Crimean War where Russian greatcoats made of woven wool, very thick and padded, where thrusts failed to penetrate them, and that was to do with the type of sword, the type of point on the sword, perhaps the sharpness of the swords, and of course the clothing that the target was wearing in that case. But generally there is a theme we see through historical sources right the way across history, that cuts very often fail to seriously injure. There have been assertions made by various historical people in the past that you could cut someone, actually wound someone with cuts a number of times, but generally speaking one thrust was enough to either put them out of combat or in fact to result in death, if not immediately then sometime later, usually a relatively short time later, either through internal bleeding, external blood loss, or just really bad injury or infection in a really long term. Now what is interesting is that any of you out there who do test cutting, if you get a sharp sword and if you create a test cutting target and put clothes on it, and I've done a video about this in the past talking about the difficulty actually of cutting through some quite basic clothes like, you know, a jumper or a military jacket or a medieval doublet. These kind of things actually provide not only shock absorption, which takes a lot of force out of the cut, because of course the cut, if I just grab a sword here, a cut actually tends to make surface contact on a fairly large area. Okay, so I'll just put down the book from it there. At best, what you can hope for, pretty much one of the easiest ways to wound with a cut, is if you hit a fairly narrow target, like someone's wrist or forearm for example, because that means only a fairly small portion of the edge makes contact with the target, and therefore more force is transferred to the target upon that blow landing. Equally, a curved blade means that less of the blade makes instant contact with the target upon impact. So in actual fact, again, you get a concentration of force. However, all cuts, regardless of the type of blade or which part of the body they land on, land over a sort of surface area of edge. And in fact, an extreme example, if you cut someone across the abdomen, we've got about 8 inches of contact there, which is an enormous amount of area for that force to be spread over. And that's why cuts on large areas like this tend to be draw cuts, so they're actually soaring into the target rather than penetrating with impact. However, compare that to a thrust. Look at the surface area of impact for the thrust. It is very, very small. It's a point. Okay? So quite simply, the amount of force concentration with a thrust is so much more, there's so much more force going into so much of a smaller area with a thrust that it's inevitable that against normal clothed human targets, a thrust will penetrate much more easily. And here's an example, now we're going to go back to the book, here's an example from history of this happening. So this is Lieutenant G.N. Money, who was in the 1st Bengal European Fusiliers, and this is from the Siege of Delhi in 1857. And he says, this is his own account of an encounter after essentially breaching the walls of Delhi during the final stages of the Siege of Delhi. And he says, I went ahead of the men and turning down a narrow place found myself in the Mori bastion amongst about 30 Pandis being mutineers. They bolted at first, but seeing I was alone came at me. I was obliged to retreat, calling out to the men who soon came up, and we polished them nearly all off. But one of them proved more than a match for me, and would have finished me if a man of my company had not rushed up with his bayonet. I then saw another man hiding under a gun, that being a cannon, and went towards him. The moment he saw me, he jumped out and came at me. I warded off his blow and gave him point, that means thrust. And the first resistance I felt was the hilt of my sword coming bump up against his breast, while warm blood spurted over my hand. Very, graphic description there. And, we don't know how truthful that is, how accurate it is. However, we do have numerous historical accounts like this of a thrust entering an opponent and actually running all the way up to the hilt. And in fact, John Jacobs of the Cinderregular Horse, a very respectable man and no particular reason to lie at all, he actually gives an account where he on horseback gives point against an enemy, I think probably a Patan enemy, I'm not 100% sure on that, but against an opponent on horseback, and in fact his sword ran right the way up to the hilt and hit with such force that it both bent the sword blade and basically disarmed John Jacob himself, and I believe it remained attached by a sword knot, that being a cord between the wrist and the sword. But essentially it disarmed him in that instant, and he said that he would never give point on horseback again. In actual fact, and I keep promising to do this, but I will do it. I will do a video at some point about how point was given, thrusts were given on horseback in a way that didn't result in you getting disarmed. But Sir Richard Francis Burton talks about this point, and he raises the Regulation Cavalry Sword Exercise Manual. And he points out that in the British Regulation Cavalry Sword Manual, it says to give almost no force with the thrust when you run into an opponent on horseback. And Burton, quite rightly, says actually, certainly don't give any push with the blade, because of course the horse is providing the momentum far more than you need to push a point through a person's body. If anything, you need to be really ginger and ready to almost retract the sword as soon as it goes into the person. Very simply because a sword will pass so easily into someone's body. So there we go. There are disadvantages to thrusts, and there are times when thrusts are a risky thing to do, and I'll talk more about that in future videos. But fundamentally, one of the strengths of a thrust is it's incredibly easy to push through a clothed human target. Cuts, not always the case. There are many records of cuts not doing any serious damage to a clothed human target at all. This being for the aforementioned reasons that I said, that you're essentially laying a large part of the blade onto a padded and covered target, and therefore a lot of the force is being dissipated, whereas with a thrust it's all being concentrated in that point. I just want to reiterate, I am not saying therefore that thrust is the superior attack, because there are many advantages to cutting, one of those being that it covers a line and all sorts of other things, but simply to say that thrusts are far more easy to wound with than cuts are in general. There we go guys, cheers!